I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to use this opportunity to show our listeners how to succeed with alliances. And I'm going to do that by sharing one big idea, 3 laws, and some tools, a peek at some of the tools. I've been working on this for quite a while. The latest book is Remake Strategy, and I'm going to draw most of my comments today from this book. So what's the big idea? The big idea is really that alliances and business combinations are like a game of poker. It doesn't mean that you can lose your shirt, although you can lose your shirt with them. You can also earn a bundle. But essentially what I mean by this idea is that the value of each card in this hand is there because of the other cards in the hand. It's the combination of cards that gives you value in the hand that you hold. And so what we want to end up doing as a business is mixing and matching combinations so that we can create assets and capabilities that can win in the marketplace. So remix strategy is essentially the combining of our assets with those from external parties, our assets and capabilities, in order to create new value. So what's the other laws? The first law is 1 + 1 is 3. You don't need me here to tell you that. In fact, it's the most common rule of thumb that we use when we talk about combinations, whether there are mergers, acquisitions, alliances, joint ventures. 1 and 1 has to be 3. But think about that a little bit harder. 1 and 1 will not automatically be 3 just because we say so. And so we need to be sure that their economic basis is there for this kind of value creation. So when we put together 2 large beer companies, does that mean that we create more value or that we save money in some way? When we put together companies from different industries, automobiles and computers, or automobiles and electric batteries, how do we put that together to actually create the value of 1 and 1 is 3? So essentially this first law says there has to be the potential for joint value by putting together 2 assets or capabilities, and without that, maybe we can stop right there because all of the rest will not pan out. So that's rule number 1, law number 1. Very important to get that right off the bat. Second law is a little bit different. 1 + 1 is 1. I don't mean that the value, of course, is just 1, but this is a management equation. So in order for the first law to work, we have to act like 1. And this means that whatever the combination that we have, there has to be collaboration which is governed in an effective way. So the alliance or the joint venture or the acquisition has to be designed properly and then managed over time so that, in fact, it can realize the value from the first law. So 1 + 1 is 3, and 1 + 1 also is 1. And the third law, which is maybe a little bit trickier to think about, is that 1 + 1 equals 1.4 + 1.6, or it could be 1.7 + 1.3. The idea is that the 3 that we create in that first law has to be divided up. And this is, of course, a very sensitive matter. It's a question of how do we share the value created. And for many alliances, etc., we prefer not to talk about this value distribution. But in the end, that is where the return on investment will come from. And when we have an acquisition, of course, this kind of sharing of value takes place right off the bat when we pay a certain premium for it, and therefore value ends up in the hands either of the target or the acquirer company. So these rules are very generally applicable. It is a prism, a lens that I look through basically to diagnose and to fix or to understand any new alliance, joint venture, or for that matter, acquisitions or mergers that come down the road. And the idea is that these 3 laws, of course, interact with each other. We need to have value which is greater than the parties could get on their own. We need to then manage this in a way that will create that value, govern it properly. And then we need to find a way to each get a return on our investment. And that is, of course, the third law. So these 3 things are the big laws. And now I'm going to share a little bit some of the tools that come out of this particular way of looking at it. The first tool is, how do you create that joint value? And it starts really with finding the right match, the right partner fit, or the fit between the target and the acquirer. This little tool shows you at a high level that what matters is that the capabilities, the assets, the various sources of competitive advantage which are listed on the left-hand side of this chart, that each company has those, and the question is, how does that fit with the strengths of the other company? And clearly what we try to find here is that one person's strength is complemented by the other company's strength. So, for example, you could look at IBM and Apple in their recent alliance on mobile computing. IBM has the strong basis in corporate accounts, in data analytics, and Apple, of course, in mobile computing, and the two together using an alliance, not an acquisition, because a merger and acquisition would not be appropriate for these two companies. But using an alliance, they're able to get joint value by putting together these sets of assets, these sets of capabilities on both sides. So this takes care a little bit of the 1 + 1 is 3. The next question is, how will they manage it? We don't know all the details of that one, but we do know that there's a choice. There's a spectrum. And this is a chart which maybe is a little complex. Let me walk you through it. Basically, the horizontal axis on the bottom tells you these different deal structures that you see, how much joint decision making, how much do we have to work with the other party in order to actually come to decisions to optimize this particular alliance. And what you see is on the top right, in your case, is a full merger, and that's full control and full integration. On the bottom left, we have contracts that are more or less competitive, that are vendor relationship, that are like purchase orders, and between. And the middle zone has many different forms of deal making, from joint ventures, which are standalone equity-based kind of corporations, to alliances that may be contractual, to other forms of deal making that we might call joint R&D or co-marketing or things like that. Now, take a look at each one of these blocks to understand really how they operate. And if we start again on the top right, that's a full integration, full control, you might say. On the bottom left, we have not full control, but we have a vendor relationship, which is a contract. And in this case, we call it a complete contract. There's a lot of work in economics around the question of complete contracts or incomplete contracts. And what you see in the middle are essentially alliances which are open-ended agreements. The contracts have gaps. They cannot foresee the future. They cannot tell us exactly how to operate this collaboration as technology evolves and as markets evolve. And so these alliances have a difficulty because they don't give you the clean control of the top right, and they don't give you the clean contract of the bottom left. So you need to manage with this open-ended agreement and using a form of shared control. So the way that sort of pans out in the life of an alliance is that we need to manage the gaps. We need to manage those pieces of the alliance that are not set in stone from the beginning. And so every alliance has this feature, that it will be affected by things that happen from the outside or inside, and then new decisions will have to be made. And as we see at the bottom part of this chart, that's what alliance governance is about. It's about basically making new decisions about questions that we haven't really thought of in advance, and that are responding to new environmental and new competitive situations that we did not foresee. And so good alliance management is to create a contract up front, an agreement up front, that allows you to manage flexibly for the new changes that will come down the road. So from this, we can get some direct pointers, some do's and don'ts as to how to manage alliances. So this is, of course, in a way the second law that I talked about before. And here are some very clear pointers, I think, for how to do this. So the 7 habits of successful alliances. So the first one is that there has to be incentives for collaboration. This means amongst the sales forces, amongst the R&D communities. There can't be a reaction which says, this is not invented here, therefore I won't work on it. So there needs to be incentives up and down the line that encourage collaboration, not just that the top has made a deal that needs to be implemented. Secondly, we need to decide clearly, where are we competing and where are we cooperating? And this is something which is more and more common, that companies collaborate with rivals, with companies that also have some part of their business as being competitive with each other. And so we have to decide clearly what is in and what is out. And by focusing this and by creating, in a sense, good fences, we can become better neighbors also. So the second, third, and fourth item here are having to do with how you govern the alliance. Firstly, there has to be clear roles. What are we doing? Who's responsible for the research, the marketing, the manufacturing, the approvals? If you are, for example, a large pharmaceutical company, there are things that a small biotech partner might do, and there are things that you end up doing, of course. And so clearing in advance, the roles of the partners is a requirement for success. And then remember that these alliances will come up with questions that we didn't foresee. So this is where we need processes for joint decision making. And I don't mean that we need to have processes whereby we can arbitrate or exit or fight about it. We need to actually find ways to solve conflict and solve decisions before they become problematic. And that's fourth rule here of having a successful alliance. The fifth and the sixth one, which is managing the joint business and the relationship, as well as building and maintaining trust. Those are classically the roles very often of what we might call an alliance management function. And so the key here is we don't focus just on the business itself and getting the business off the ground, the sales and the technology, but we also focus on the relationship and making sure that that evolves in a positive way. And by doing that is how we can build trust. And obviously maintaining trust and maintaining our commitments is a foundation for a continued cooperation. And finally, invest resources in all of this, in alliance governance and all of what I just described. Probably the largest or the single most important failure mode for joint ventures, alliances, and many other combinations is the failure to invest in doing this right. And so I tried to show you some of the big rules, some of the big laws that need to be in a way fulfilled. And then with these do's and don'ts, it'll get you halfway there, but you have to continue to invest in it to make it successful. So what happens when you are following these laws and you're successful at it and one alliance works out? It turns out that there are probably more alliances in your future than you think. This is a quick picture of the alliances that are now very common in the airline industry, and we all know this from flying, One World and SkyTeam and Star Alliance. These are all portfolios, constellations in my book that are stitching together companies. Again, it's a remix. It's the same idea of getting the right cards in your hand, but in this case, there are multiple partners. And there are more and more industries where this idea of one group competing against another group, instead of a firm against a firm, is more and more relevant. So we find this in media, we find this in the Internet of Things, for example. We find this basically in any business where there are multiple components that need to be aligned in order to be successful. And so to do this, you have to kind of follow those habits over and over again, as well as obviously manage the portfolio as a whole. And in my book, I go into more detail on that. I think it's important to harken back to the fundamentals of what makes business combinations and alliances successful. I've tried to give you some big ideas, the cards that need to be aligned well. 3 rules. The first one is make sure that there is joint value to be had. Secondly, collaborate, design the collaboration, manage the collaboration so you can reach that joint value. And thirdly, find a way to distribute the value in a way that maintains the incentives for both sides to stay involved. And obviously there's a lot more that I could talk about, but I look forward to further comments and questions from the listeners perhaps later today. Thank you for your attention.